Hi, it's Alex Cosper with SacTV.com. Welcome to another studio chat. I'll be getting back to the river where I love to do these kind of talk shows. Um, I guess eventually, sometime in the summer, but I kind of enjoy doing the studio chats. I want to build up some of these studio chat videos. Today, I want to do a special tribute to a Sacramento legend, to a TV personality who, for nearly half a century, was in everybody's living rooms here in town and was considered like just one of the top local figures in town, and that was Stan Atkinson, who died on May 26th, 2025, at the age of 92. He had been on Sacramento television since the 50s. Um, let's go through his life story a little bit real quickly, and then I'll give you my perspectives on how he evolved with the evolution of television. Okay, so he was born in 1932, same year my mom was born. And so, like my mom and Stan Atkinson, they saw television enter pop culture. You know, they knew the world before television, which is interesting. Because most of us, I was born in 1962, most of us have only been alive during the television era. Since I've read a lot about it, I studied media history when I was at Sac State, majored in communications. Um, so anyway, Stan started in radio first. That's where a lot of television personalities started. And he started in Spokane, Washington in the early 50s after a time in the military. And then by 1957, he was hired by KCRA in Sacramento, Channel 3. And a couple years later, he became the head anchor at KCRA. He stayed in that position until 1963 and then moved to Los Angeles. And then he worked at KTVU in Oakland, and then bounced back to Los Angeles at KNX, an NBC affiliate, in the late 60s. Then in the 70s, he bounced back to the Bay Area to work at KTVU in Oakland before returning to KCRA in 1976 as the head anchor, from 1976 to 1994. And that's a lot of years to be doing that position on television and, being, a daily figure in people's lives. So after that, he switched over to rival KOVR Channel 13 from 94 to 1999. Then he retired. I met him once during that whole time while he was involved with the Jerry Lewis telethon. Got to shake his hand because I was there to volunteer to answer phones while I was in the radio biz. It was something we did as part of our public service. And it was nice to shake his hand because I had known him, who he was, for many, many years. And to me, he was a celebrity. So I want to share with you, when I went to Sac State in the early 80s, I wrote a report about local media, and I got an A on this paper, and I'm proud of this paper. That's why I kept it. It's many, many pages of reviews of KCRA TV, and I'm proud of it because the teacher was worked in television. Her name was Janice Ginn. She worked at Channel 40, KTXL Channel 40 in Sacramento. And it was bizarre that I was at Sac State and took a class from someone who actually worked in the broadcast industry. And another reason I'm proud of this paper is because working as a student in her class, she said that I stood out as like the one person she would recommend to Channel 40 for an internship for news writing. And I was blown away with that. So she set me up with an interview with Bob Cook at Channel 40. He was known to viewers. He had a show at night. He did a commentary late at night on Channel 40. But he was also the guy who hired, people there. And so I go to Channel 40 on Fruit Ridge Road, and he had me go into this room and showed me the teletype and the news wires, all the news coming in. And what he wanted me to do was spend about a half hour looking at all this news and write my own stories from the wire, Associated Press and all these news sources, and come up with my own stories. And then he would check that to see if I was a fit to be a news writer for Channel 40. So I did that for a half hour, and I just noticed it was like story after story was just murder after murder, crime after crime, accident after accident. It was all this depressing stuff that I did not want to talk about. My dream at that time was to be in radio, to play music and mix talk with music, but in a way that wasn't depressing. So I flat out told him when he came back in the room, I don't think this is for me. I really would rather be in radio playing music and talking about music and talking about upbeat things than to be talking about all this murder stuff. And he seemed to understand, and that was it. That was the end of my TV career. But anyway, I wrote this paper for Janice Jin in her class, and she became the notable TV person herself, eventually ending up at KRON TV in San Francisco. In a very prominent position there. So I wrote these reviews of Channel 3, KCRA, and let me just read to you what I said about Stan Atkinson back then in 1982. And keep in mind that back then, I didn't know what I wanted to be yet in media. I knew a lot about media from majoring in communications and media studies at Sac State. But I didn't know which direction I wanted to go yet, TV, radio, or whatever. And I even thought I was going to be a rock star. I wrote all these songs, and I thought, wow, these are better songs than on the radio. Of course, every songwriter thinks that, but I also understood the hookiness of commercial top 40 music, and I just knew how to write hooky songs. So that was kind of on the back burner in my life, but at the same time, I knew that was a much more challenging endeavor that probably wasn't going to happen. So I focused more on radio as my main goal, and television was still a possibility until, of course, I went to that Channel 40 interview. But I wrote this review about Channel 3 reports, and this is what I said about Stan Atkinson. And again, keep in mind, he had been sent to Afghanistan during this time to do coverage of that invasion, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which, that's what killed the Soviet Union, is they drained their economy on fighting Afghanistan, and which was backed by the United States, and so we just pretty much drained their economy. But we didn't know that at the time, and we also did not know that the people that the people we were supporting in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, there was all these independent factions of groups that were defending against the Soviet invasion. We did not know that that would eventually evolve into the Taliban, which eventually took over Afghanistan. So much we didn't know back then in 1982. And some people might wonder, I myself wondered, why is Stan Atkinson going to Afghanistan? Like, isn't this supposed to be about local news? You would think that if he were going there, he would tell us something that was insightful that we couldn't learn from any other news source. But that's not really what it was about. It was more about more about him becoming part of the story and KCRA identifying itself as an expanding news source. Hey, we're covering international news now. We're sending one of our top people over there to Afghanistan to cover a story there. And what he was doing was he was interviewing like Afghan soldiers. But just 3 years earlier, an ABC TV journalist named Bill Stewart was killed in Nicaragua covering the battleground there in 1979. So it was still kind of fresh on a lot of people's minds that you could actually be a media person and get killed on the job. So anyway, let me read you the review of what I said about Stan back then in 1982. Although the format of the program is news, the personalities of the talent slightly overshadow the stories. Stan Atkinson is a classic example of a man who puts personality into the job. He has a very calm and friendly delivery, always speaking in a concerned manner. Atkinson also carried his nice guy image with him to Afghanistan, where he was doing a series of special reports for KCRA. In order for him to cover the story, he had to disguise himself by growing a beard and wearing Afghan clothes. Each report focused on the tragically abused Afghan soldiers, many who were suffering in hospitals. This sympathetic slant probably helped strengthen KCRA's image as an expanding news source. When Stan returned to Sacramento, he still had a beard. Interestingly, the gray-streaked beard gave him a more intellectual image. The removal of his beard was treated as a feature story. Tom Duhane fills in when Stan is away. Personality is the message of Channel 3 reports. 25 years ago, reporters had an objective attitude in the news media. But with the arrival of new journalism and the emphasis on local programming, reporters no longer stand outside the news like invisible observers. Today, they are part of the news since they have acquired celebrity status. Therefore, Sacramento has become a mini Hollywood for Stan, Susan, Betty, and Creighton. I don't know if that's true, but let me correct something I said back then. That was my perspective as a college student back then. But we were taught, that news journalism was very objective prior to the 60s, that it was just hard cut facts, not much personality embedded in there. However, I want to correct that because someone who's considered the father of journalism, Edward R. Murrow, back in the black and white days when he would do his news reports, he'd also be smoking a cigarette on camera. And even back then they knew that was bad for your health. So you're basically advertising something deadly to a mass audience. And back then, tobacco companies were the big sponsors of TV news. And even worse than that, they would open the show. Back then, sponsors were the star of the broadcast. They would let you know. They would make it clear. Whatever the show was, the sponsor was the most important thing. You'd find out at the beginning of the show. And they sometimes would talk for 5 minutes, like an oil company would talk for 5 minutes about what the oil companies were doing that was good for the world before they got into any news reporting. So anyway, I just want to point that out, that sponsorships heavily overshadowed the news content prior to the 1960s. Also, throughout the entire history of the Cold War, which lasted from the late 40s through the late 80s, there was this American propaganda embedded in American news that was anti-Russian, anti-Soviet, anti-communist. There was always an undertone when reporting on news stories that involved the Cold War. Of course, by the mid-70s, you had all these news crews and markets all over America that started to have women in them. But before that, like in the 60s, it's hard to find any news crews with women TV reporters. The first national TV journalist was Barbara Walters in 1976 on ABC. But again, prior to that, you did have local news that had featured women, but a lot of times it was just for the weather or, just as a reporter. But by the late 70s, then you started having women TV anchors. So anyway, Stan Atkinson was teamed up with different women throughout his career. Sue Pearson, later when he went to KOVR, it was with Jennifer Whitney. So that became kind of the formula for TV news journalism, was to have a male and female as the top anchors. And a lot of times the weather person would be a female, not always. And it was rare to see a woman doing sports. Usually it was this, really hardcore sports male macho guy doing sports. So anyway, all that evolved. I watched it changed in the 80s. It became more of what it is today, starting in the 80s. And color TV was another big change that happened, especially KCRA, was one of the first stations in America to broadcast completely in color. That's partly because it was an NBC affiliate, and NBC is the network that ushered in color. NBC was the original TV network, and after that came CBS. And then after that, the Justice Department thought NBC was too big of this monopoly, so it chopped it into two pieces, and one of them became ABC. By 1966, all TV was in color. Prior to that, it was a lot of black and white, some color, and if you go back to the 50s, it was almost all black and white, although color did start to creep in television in the late 50s, introduced during the Eisenhower administration. In fact, I think he was the first person on color TV on NBC back in the late 50s. Another innovation was that editing became a big thing. Prior to, if you go back and watch news clips of 1963, the JFK assassination, you'll notice that transitions from one story to the next would be kind of awkward and abrupt, and you'd see flickers of just awful looking glitches in between stories. But they finally learned how to edit, I guess, by the late 60s, and that gave you a more seamless presentation. And investing in all that technology and talent was John Kelly, the head of KCRA. John Kelly is really who made the station #1 in Sacramento all those decades. I mean, Stan helped, but it was John Kelly who had the sense to invest in talent like Stan Atkinson and other great talent to make it the #1 station in Sacramento. A few things about Stan. He interviewed some famous people like Jerry Lewis and Betty Davis, and I'm sure there's a countless list of other people. Probably more like local figures, politicians, since Sacramento is the capital of California. He may have got to interview governors and stuff like that. That I don't know, but I know that he got to interview Charles Manson in 1975, and I don't like saying got to interview him because Manson was, kind of a horrible mass murderer, brainwasher, but at the same time, he had a cult following of people who thought he was a genius, almost like Elon Musk or something like that, except Elon Musk is not a murderer. But people thought everything he said was brilliant, and the fact that he interviewed Charles Manson in prison, that's a big news story because not too many TV journalists were allowed to do that. Another KCRA TV journalist who interviewed Manson was Mike Boyd. And you can find that interview on YouTube, but I can't find the interview with Atkinson and Manson from 1975. Now, I would say the high points of Stan's career weren't those things. It was more like just the fact that he was involved in community events, and he made himself available for speeches and things like that. Like in 2003, I saw him at Sac State. He was the honorary speaker at my brother's graduation ceremony, and it was kind of touching because he talked about how his son had passed away, and it gave him a different outlook on life, and it was just a pretty touching speech. So that was the last time I saw Stan. I didn't talk to him then, but I saw him from the crowd, and it was another amazing moment in my life because he was just this figure I had seen on TV all my life. And seeing someone in person after seeing them through all this electronic media, and meeting them once, is just a very memorable moment in my life. Anyway, I think he made a big contribution to the local community, and that's why he's remembered and probably will be remembered for a long time here in Sacramento. Could I have done what Stan Atkinson did? I don't think so. I think he was the top talent for what he did for Sacramento. And it's funny because one of the reasons I could have never done that job was because I just didn't like wearing suits. And he jokingly said in some of his interviews that when he first found out he was going to be a TV anchor, but he said, "But I don't have a suit." And his boss said, "Well, you need to go get one." So anyway, I would not have been that guy, I don't think. I was more into being aligned with music, and so that's why I want to share with you some of my music now, and it kind of goes along with the 50s and the 60s and the history of music. Kind of a flashback. I have always liked surf music, which was the music of the early 60s, and so I want to bring it back to life because I think that's an important sound in music. It kind of created a new direction for rock and roll, and then splintered off into all these other different genres, including psychedelia. But I came up with a new surf tune that I want you to hear, and it's for my, I guess, imaginary band, or if I ever have a live band, it'll be called Sunsetrip. But I did all the instrumentation of this. This is called Surf Insider. Surf inside her, surf inside her. Surf